Dear students, continuing with our session from our previous sessions where we were discussing the evolution of advertising. This particular session will focus on the history of Indian advertising. So, we'll look at the pre-independence era, and then we'll look at the post-independence era and the new millennium. So, our focus on advertising would be accordingly. So, if you look at the history of Indian advertising, before independence, most of the advertising was basically colonial advertising. Ads were imported from abroad and they were simply published in India. So, not much of advertising creativity, or I should say homegrown advertising, was prevalent then. Mostly it was a remnant of the colonial era. So, if you were to look at advertising in India also, we have the print era, which you could call it from 1780s to 1920s, when we started having the first printed newspapers and magazines in India. And then we have the era of radio and cinema, which is 1930s to 1950s. And then we had the golden television age, 1978 to 1991. And after that, we have the satellite and digital boom. We saw the advent of satellite television after the first Gulf War, and satellite became very, very popular all across India. And then we had satellite dishes, and later on we had things like the Dish TV, which were sponsored by, or which was started by Zee in India for the first time. And then we have the digital form, like we have Jio's live TV, digital TV, where you can watch channels. So, we have done away with a dish and everything. We watch live television over the internet. The same thing over the internet. So, colonial origins of advertising can be traced back 1780 to 1900. Even though we got independence in 1947, why do we say colonial? Because most of the advertising at that point of time was imported. So, on the left hand side of the screen, you can see Bengal's Hickey's Gazette. So, India's earliest advertisements were like commercials. They were basically like classified ads, which we have seen in the case of US newspapers also. So, they were merely classified ads. So, the earliest advertisements appeared in the colonial newspaper called as Hickey's Bengal Gazette, which started in 1780. So, it was one of the first newspapers to start, and that is why we have mentioned the date or the timeline from starting from 1780. So, that was the subcontinent's first English language newspaper. And what did they advertise, or what was being advertised, was basically in the form of classified ads. So, you had notices which were, if you want to call them, you can call them as auction notices, which dealt with sale of imported goods and colonial estates, shipping bulletins, British imports, soaps, fabrics, they were all imported. So, Pear soap was imported from the United Kingdom or Great Britain or England, as you would want to call it. Fabrics, spirits and luxury goods, they were all imported from Britain. So, basically these notices served British merchants and colonial administrators, not the Indian population at large. In 1905 is a landmark year in India, because this was the birth of organized advertising. We had the first advertising agency start in India, and it was called as B. Dattaram and Company. Then in 1920s, urban India saw outdoor advertising, and as India's city expanded, especially places like Kolkata, which was the headquarters of East India Company at one point of time. We had tram advertising. You can see a tram on the left hand side, and we had moving billboards throughout the city, because television was not there, radio was not there in India at that point of time. So, basically it was out of home advertising, and the most popular form of out of home advertising was walking advertising with the help of trams and public transport, posters and hoardings, out of home. And then we had the rising urban audiences in places like Mumbai, Delhi and Calcutta. So, it was meant and targeted towards them. Then we had the media revolution. In the 1930s, India is characterized by media revolution, and radio and cinema changed the game. So, the arrival of All India Radio in 1936, so that is a landmark year. and the explosion of Hindi talkies transformed, that is, so earliest form of cinema in India is called as talkies. Why? And that was, I'll tell you, it's a very interesting thing. Uh, why do we call them talkies? For the simple reason that we had pictures. Earlier we had the bioscope kind of thing, somebody who would roam and they would show you, you could actually see, you could put your eyes and you can see some colorful images uh, juxtaposed, and you could actually see, but there was no sound involved. So later on we had these cinema halls, and the cinema halls were actually called as talkies. So we had Regal talkies, and we had Surjeet talkies, and there were so many talkies, famous talkies. So there were cinema halls were called talkies because they used to play movies, and where the character, you can hear the character talking and you can hear the sound. So 1936 is a landmark year. You had All India Radio starting its operation in India, and then you had Indian movies also proliferate. And this transformed from visual texts that you could see, static text and images that you could see in outdoor advertising or newspaper or even the magazines, to something which could bring in emotion. So radio could bring in emotion, and advertising, and you could have storytelling involved. So brands are built around storytelling. So brands could now speak directly into homes and movie halls, and they could communicate with the consumer directly. So when people saw the ads in the cinema halls, the brands were speaking to them directly. When the radio was playing in the background, people were listening to Binaka Geet Mala. People could hear the brands telling stories about themselves between the commercial breaks. So they were reaching millions, and one of the most popular way to reach millions in India was through talkies and the radio. Radio was a household item. After independence, I think radio had the highest reach. So Hindi cinema became one of the most powerful advertising vehicles of the 20th century, embedding brands into popular culture. Then advertising during the war, that is the World War and the War of Independence, it was basically about rationing products. A lot of things were rationed. My father, who was obviously a small child when India got independence, because he was born in 1936, so he must have been some 10, 11 years old. But when he was building the house that we live in today, he told me that cement was rationed, and he was talking of the 70s. So in 70s, cement was rationed. Just imagine. So during this era, World War II reshaped Indian advertising dramatically. Scarcity of goods and services pushed the brands towards a patriotic fervor. As we saw in the case of America, we saw an ad where the ad was about carpooling, and petrol and diesel and automobile fuel was very, very scarce. So the idea was to promote carpooling. They said if you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, and Hitler was a despised figure in America. The Americans were fighting the Germans. So therefore, it was all about nationalistic fervor and emotional advertising. So in the Indian movement also infused advertising with new vocabulary of nationalism and self-reliance. And why did this all happen? Due to wartime scarcity, nationalist fervor and celebrity influence. Everything was about Swadeshi. Gandhiji led that Swadeshi movement. So this is a very, very interesting ad that you can see on the left hand side of your screen. You have one of the most famous Indian celebrities of that particular era, and her name is Leela Chitnis, and she was one of the first supermodel of her time, and she endorsed a beauty soap called as Lux. And Lux till date over the years has been famous for having the top notch film actress of the time endorsing the soap brand. So be it Sridevi, be it Rekha, be it Hema Malini, be it Jayaprada, be it Sridevi, be it Meenakshi Seshadri, be it Madhuri Dixit, be it anybody else that you can think of in recent times, Aishwarya Rai, and anybody else that you can think of who's had been at the helm of the affairs, Rani Mukherjee, they've all been endorsing this particular soap brand. So 1941 is a milestone year. It was the year when Leela Chitnis became the face of Lux soap in India. and it set a precedent that would define Indian advertising for decades. The campaign fused aspiration and trust, a film star's glamorous personality transferred directly onto the mass market product. So everybody who wanted beauty like a film star. See, if you imagine India of the time, India was not like we see it as today. Especially the younger generation is not aware. We were, I mean, if we talk of India of the 70s, of the 80s, we did not have much choice. I mean, if it was a bathing soap for men, it was a Lifebuoy. If it was a soap for female, it had to be Pears or it could be Hammam. So, Hammam was a green soap. So, there are many other green soaps which had neem as their most, I should say, active ingredient. And if you had a beauty soap, it used to be Lux. So, we had very limited choices. Today, you are wooed by Camay and Dove, and not only soaps, you are wooed by face washes, hundreds of face washes. Now, nobody wants to use a soap, everybody wants a face wash. So, face washes have become very, very popular these days. So, most of the advertising of the 1947 era to 1959, this was about nation building. So, advertising was very, very patriotic, very, very nationalistic, and it was built on emotional appeal. 1960s is characterized by the professionalization era. This is where Indian advertising came of age. So, we saw Indian advertising agencies proliferate, and Indian advertising agencies started offering services professionally the way they were being offered in the US. So, they started offering all the traditional advertising services such as strategic planning and product creation, ad creation, production, media planning and everything, and also providing a marketing orientation. Client servicing service, client management services were also being provided. So, 1960s is also characterized as an era where we had the revolution in terms of market research. So, we had, if you can see, some of the names are listed here. We have the National Readership Surveys, which mapped newspapers and magazines audience across major Indian cities. We had the Market Research India (MRI), providing detailed consumer and behavior and demographic profiling. Then we had shop audits, consumer insights. So, a lot of data was available to the marketers to glean key consumer insights and tailor their ads accordingly. Then in 70s, there was a strategic shift, and this can be called as the market segmentation. And what was the market segment here? So, the markets were segmented into metropolitan markets, urban markets, rural markets, semi-urban markets, and based on these classification, products were developed. So, the 1970s forced advertisers to confront India's profound diversity, because India is a diverse country. You have poor people, you have very rich, you have the super rich, and you have a large middle class, lower middle class, lower upper class. So, India, and these classes in themselves constitute a huge number. If you were to look at the middle class, that is a substantially huge number. Maybe the super rich, but even if in a country like India, if you were to take the super rich, they would also constitute a very big class in terms of numbers. So, rural marketing became a dedicated discipline then. Then we had television advertising in 1978. Doordarshan was set up, although it did not catch the fancy of the Indian masses then, because most of the advertising was basically black and white, and broadcasting was black and white. It was only after the Asian Games in 1982 we had a color television, color advertising revolution in India and color television revolution in India. So, when I say color advertising, it can only be possible if there is a color television, and not only a color television, but color television broadcasting. So, 1982 is the landmark when we had the Asian Games in India. So, India broadcast the 1982 Asian Games, and this was a colored broadcast. So, ultimately that played a major role. That gave a big fillip to the Indian advertising industry, not only to the Indian advertising industry, to the Indian television industry as well. So, we had a lot of serials and soap operas which started coming up, and we had India's one of the first soap opera, which is called as Hum Log. And after that, Hum Log, we had Ye Jo Bhi Hai Zindagi, and there are many others very, very popular soap operas. So the India's first television soap opera, I've already told you why do we call it as soap opera? Where did this word come from? This word come from major advertising agencies like the Procter & Gamble and Unilever worldwide. They had a lot of soap brands. So these soap brands were basically the sponsor of these programs, and that is why they were called as soap operas. So in 1984, Hum Log became the biggest or the first soap opera of Indian television. And Maggi Noodles sponsored the show in India, even though it is called a soap opera. Just look at the irony. I mean, it's called as a soap opera, first soap opera, yet it was Maggi which was sponsoring the program, nobody else. I mean, I wish I should say it was not, there was no soap brand which was actually behind it. Even then, it was called as a soap opera. So, Maggi Noodles became a rage in India using Hum Log. 2 minutes, and that was something, because if you go back in time and if you look at the success of Maggi from this particular by sponsoring this particular soap opera Hum Log, it had to do with the changing consumer tastes and the problems that were there in India. Cooking gas was very, very scarce. Most of the people used to cook food on traditional stoves using kerosene or even wood, and cooking food on kerosene or wood used to take a lot of time, and most of the time children would fall asleep hungry because the food was not cooked in time. In villages, I mean, it was a very, very tiring affair. So housewives or the females of the house, that is how the system was. It was a patriarchal system where the men used to work in the fields and women used to take care of the household. So I'm just I don't have any views on this. I believe that both male and female, they should have equal opportunities. But nevertheless, that is how the system was. So females would wake up at dawn and they would start the daily chores because it would take a lot of time to make breakfast. And by the time they had finished with breakfast, they had to start the lunch because cooking would take a lot of time. And similarly, dinner used to take a lot of time. And most of the villages in India did not have electricity. And because of this, people used to fall asleep very early and wake up at dawn. So most of the children, I recall as a small child when we would go to our paternal home place where my father came from, there was no electricity, and the aunts and the relatives, they would start cooking in the evening, probably 4 or 5 o'clock, and we as children, we, after having exhausted ourselves, we would sleep somewhere around 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock maximum, and by the time if the food was not ready, we would sleep. So that is where Maggi, I mean, with this their 2-minute thing, they caught the fancy of the Indian household, especially the females and the children. So it was a boon for the mothers. They could immediately make Maggi in 2 minutes, just put it in boiling water, give it to their children, and they would not fall asleep hungry. So this is just an example. So in India, with the advent of the first soap opera and television, especially the color television, I mean, there were very few entertainment outlets. Today, you have hundreds of entertainment outlets. You have these malls, you have these restaurants, you have these parks, and you have so many things. You have these cinema halls, PVRs. You have a lot of things on your hand. But we are talking of India of the 70s, of the 80s, of the early 90s. People were strapped for entertainment. The only entertainment was with the help of television, with the help of these soap operas. The entire household would sit and watch. That was the only form of entertainment. When I was a college going student, I remember these popular, very, very popular serials, Ramayana and Mahabharata. The shops would not open. They were aired in the morning, and the shops would not open until and unless, I mean, they would only open after people had finished watching the serials. And once the serial was over, they would come and open up the shops. So that was a craze then in the 80s and the 90s. There was no other form of entertainment. Today, people hardly watch television. You get everything on your mobile phone, on your laptop, minute by minute. Even if Facebook has become, or YouTube, you get the news as well. You are informed every second. You have a mobile phone. If it is Google Android based, it's Google is enabled, and you keep on getting information. So there's an information overload, news overload, I would say. Now, that's an interesting story about Nirma. So Nirma was a brand which capitalized on the Indian advertising and especially the advent of television. It created a brand, and there was a gentleman called as Karsan Bhai Patel. He was from Gujarat, and what he realized was that they were pretty expensive washing powders in India, and those washing powder being Surf. So he thought, why not? India has a huge middle class and lower middle class who find it very difficult to buy Surf. So Surf was a premium brand then. They said he came up with a brand called as Nirma, which was 3 rupees or 3.5 rupees a kg as compared to 11 or 12 rupees or 15 rupees a kg of Surf. And he had a very enduring jingle, and they had a Nirma girl, and the jingle was washing powder Nirma, and ultimately Nirma made a huge inroad into the Indian market and became the #1 detergent brand in India. It continued for a long period of time, but it was only in the late 90s that the brand suddenly, uh, I should say, became the consumers and the brand's audience started developing a, or I should say, they started becoming disinterested in the brand in terms of buying it again and again. So there are many other reasons for that, but coming back to the point, in terms of Indian advertising, Nirma is a brand which was created using television advertising. Maggi again was a brand which was created using television advertising. So in 1985, India, we had our first Advertising Standards Council of India, ASCI. It was for consumer protection, and it was I should say there was self-regulation which was involved here, and they made, as they had a set of code for all the advertisers, and the idea was to have advertising which was transparent, which was not disparaging, which was truthful, which was less in puffery, things like that. So 1991 is a landmark year as far as India is concerned. India, after facing a huge forex crisis, balance of payment crisis, liberalized its economy in 1991, and the architect of the new economic policy was Manmohan Singh, our former Prime Minister, who was the finance minister in the Narasimha Rao government. So 1991 changed how India operated, the Indian economy, the brands which operated, everything changed completely. Suddenly India opened up its economy, and by 1994, 95, 96, we had most of the foreign brands come in India, the big brands. And today you can find whatever brand is being sold in US, if it has a market in India, it will be there in India. So today it's if you go to a shop, you'll see 20 brands of soap, you'll see 30 brands of shampoos. Every brand that you can think of which has a global presence, which is reputed, is available. It is all a result of the liberalization in 1991. That also opened up foreign advertising agencies coming to India. So it's a double-edged sword. So you had a lot of competition come to India also. So the entire Indian advertising agency changed. So you had the homegrown agencies. Now these homegrown agencies, what they did was they tied up with foreign companies, foreign advertising agencies. So Zee TV was one of the first satellite cable television homegrown in India. We had other channels which were uplinked from Singapore, like for example the Star Group. Later on, the Star Group changed its name. We still have some Star Group remnants. Some of the channels are still there. So we had a satellite and TV explosion in after 1991 when we had the first Gulf War. So first Gulf War, between Iraq and the United States and its allies in 1991, where we had not the George Bush, but the father of George Bush, who was also called as George W. Bush. So the first war was between Saddam Hussein, who had invaded Kuwait. So Kuwait was liberated. So that was the time when the first Gulf War was beamed, of first war of any kind was beamed live on television. So CNN covered this Gulf War in 1991 and introduced Indians to satellite TV. Zee TV is the pioneer as far as India is concerned. It launched its first private Hindi channel, followed by DD Metro, Star, and Sony. And audiences fragmented across dozens of channels, forcing advertisers to develop more targeted media strategies for the first time. So with that, earlier it used to be Doordarshan, it used to be All India Radio. So advertisers were very clear. It was only the timing that to decide. That is, most of the cricket matches were telecast on, all the cricket matches were telecast on Doordarshan, if at all they were telecasted. All the hockey matches, football matches, news, soap operas, movies, Chitrahar, everything was on the Doordarshan. So it was very easy for advertiser. But later on, with the advent of cable television, audience fragmented. Somebody started watching Zee TV, somebody started watching Star, started watching Star Sports rather than Doordarshan. Somebody started watching Sony Television, Sony Entertainment, and so on and so forth. So audience fragmented, and regional television channels also boomed, like KTV, Sun TV, Tamil channels, Kerala, many Malayalam channels, many channels in Tamil and language, Telugu languages, Odia, so on and so forth. So media became fragmented, and that was a concern for the advertisers. Later on, India, after 2000, we had the boom, internet boom. We had Dhirubhai Ambani's famous mobile revolution in India, Mera Sapna Sabka Apna, and ultimately this resulted in a mobile boom in India, where mobile telephony cost became, or the cost of owning a mobile telephone became very cheap. And not only owning a mobile phone, but calling people also became very cheap. So that was an era which is called as the digital, and today is an AI era. So most of the advertising that you see is internet driven, because people have stopped watching television. Very few people watch television. Most of the people are hooked onto mobile phones, and reels are an addiction, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or even YouTube Shorts. They are an addiction. But then advertisers, always like air and water, they find their way. So you'll find ads everywhere. Ads, you'll find they're all pervasive. So they are in every form of media. So today, the brand to build after 2010, the best way to build a brand is to use traditional advertising wherever you can, but use digital, digital and internet, digital advertising, and use internet advertising, and use AI to create ads, and use artificial intelligence to reach your audience. So today mobile phones have become so smart. They were called as smartphones, but they have become so smart. AI has become so smart that if you talk of something, you will get an ad for that particular product. Mobile phones have become so smart and so intelligent. So with AI, you can target specific audiences. Thank you. So that is all for me in this particular session. Thank you.